Hello, my name is Richard Sumich. I'm the Vice President of Communications for Hewlett-Packard, Asia Pacific and Japan. I've been working in the field of communications for around 20 years, both in Australia and New Zealand and here in the Asia Pacific.
So what is the role of the PR practitioner?
The role of the PR practitioner ultimately is to positively influence the public towards their company, their brand, their cause, their product or service. Essentially, you could see them as a bridge between content and stakeholders. And the most critical of that is really the journalists, and they're there to help them create compelling and interesting stories that the public will want to read. The role of the journalist is essentially to create great content that will draw the reader to the page or the publication. In many ways, they're there to educate, to inform, to entertain, to investigate, in varying degrees depending on the publication. You know, in many instances, the journalist has a very special, elevated status because of their perceived impartiality and also their readiness in many cases to speak truth to power.
How would you describe the relationship between these two professions?
The relationship between these two professions is a very close, and you could call it a symbiotic one. In fact, you can see that in the core of it, they're both trying to reach the same outcome. They're both trying to get something interesting to a reader, something that the reader will be drawn to, and they're both working together to achieve that outcome. Obviously, they come with different background interests. The journalist trying to ensure that their publication is successful, the PR practitioner with the interest of their company. But at the end of the day, they're both creating content and they're both working very closely to make that interesting for the public.
What is paramount in terms of making this relationship work?
So really, like any relationship, trust underpins that between the journalist and the PR practitioner. You know, the consequences for something appearing in the press are significant. They're important for the journalist, the publication, the practitioner, and the company or organisation they represent. So trust is important. Transparency of information and intent and accuracy, all those things come together. And without it, the relationship just doesn't work at all.
Over the years?
Well, the relationship has changed quite a lot, particularly in the last 8 to 10 years. I mean, we've seen what is nothing short of a revolution from the days of print to online, and that's been dramatic. You know, the tech revolution and that change has really put a lot of pressure on the commercial side of organisations. You know, they've had their profits cut in many instances and found it hard to generate revenue from the content. And that's really driven an issue of resources and time and a commitment to investigation and sourcing and developing stories. So across that, you would say now the journalists I speak to are faced with a very difficult situation. They're forced to produce more stories in more places and certainly with a lot more immediacy than they have ever had to do before. And that pressure on them has just increased and increased while the resources have gone down. And that's been quite a difficult situation. The implications for the PR practitioner are huge, and the relationship with the journalist are huge. You know, journalists now faced with reduction of resources and availability of time itself have become far more reliant on PR practitioners to provide them with content, to provide them with news, to provide them with information that they probably just wouldn't have the ability or reach to get without that being in place. So it's changed, and also with that, the speed has changed how things are published. You know, the journalist has to get out really fast to be ahead of their competition. So often that means as they get information from the PR practitioner, they are in a race against time to get that online first. And it means that often there really is no filter or a limited filter between when the information is provided and when it suddenly appears as news. It's immediate, it's fast, and it's changed everything in the relationship.
Does that mean that it's possible for PR practitioners to take advantage of this?
I'm sure in some ways it does seem there can be that temptation. You know, you provide the information straight away and you know it's going to, in many cases, go straight online or in publication. But you know, that's going to be very short-lived. It's a bit like writing blank checks for your builder or for buying things. It's just not going to work. But it does really bring into that core question of, what is often perceived as the conflict of interest between a practitioner who's doing the bidding of their company and the journalist, and their need to be impartial and write great stories. But when you think about it for a moment, the level of scrutiny for publications, for articles now, is really significant. The engagement with the community, the engagement with people who look and comment and read, and the reader's ability to provide feedback is immense. That means that the inaccuracies are going to be shown up very, very quickly. And the journalist really has a heavy responsibility as a gatekeeper of information. If anything has brought those two needs closer together and that trust, in fact that immediacy has helped drive it. So really, in reality, many journalists and I think PR practitioners have come to the same conclusion. They're both in the same boat together. They both have to work in a relationship over a period of time.
On building trust.
Sure. In building trust, I think one of the first things is the content and the value exchange. It really amazes me how many PR practitioners are so consumed by their own company or product or their own story, they really forget about what is in it for the journalist and what really matters to them. The single most important thing you can do to build trust is provide valuable content, unique content that allows the journalist to write a story that just stops people in their tracks and make them want to read, and it really builds their reputation. So thinking about that, you have to start by really understanding what the publication is, what the journalist cares about, and what sort of angle they could deliver for their readers. And that really means telling a story and building an amazing story. An example, one of my team did some work not too long ago for GE, the GE medical imaging side of things. This is not necessarily a hot topic in people's daily lives. They don't look at what brand the X-ray machine in the hospital is. It's not visible to them. But he found that one of the researchers in Australia was actually doing some work with koalas and the study of chlamydia, which is a big problem in 90% of the koalas apparently. And they donated a piece of medical equipment to help that study and help cure them. He built a story out of that went viral. It was amazing. It was not only on mainstream news in Australia, but it went to CNN and it went international because it has all the most interesting elements. A beautiful animal, a real need, something that people can understand. And it had cut through in a way that no corporate story ever could, no corporate spokesperson or press release could ever achieve. It was valuable, interesting content. It was telling a story, and also had a spokesperson that was special, that was clearly not a corporate stooge, that really understood their content and could tell it so amazingly. So really, if you think about that, how you make sure that you deliver those stories, make sure that your news really is news, that's when the journalists will come to trust and rely on you. Within that, of course, are the very fundamental and critical basics: transparency, accuracy, honesty, thinking about giving examples, statistics, quotes and information, and giving it in formats that the journalist can readily use and that they can understand what the story is without having to dig through everything. These are some of the fundamental foundation hygiene practices that also build that trust with the journalist. So this is really where you start. The content is king, the news is king, the story is king. Think of it uniquely, help the journalist tell it, and help them write an amazing story. That's the most important thing you can do.
You mentioned on transparency and accuracy. Can you expand on the importance of that?
Sure. Actually, this is a really important topic. It's the other major issue when you think about it, the reputation of PR itself. Are we there to spin or are we there to inform? In my experience, most PR practitioners are incredibly ethical. They really understand that they're the final gatekeeper between their organisation and the outside world. They understand the importance of the relationship with the media, and they really understand and see themselves as, in many ways, as the conscience of the organisation or the company. They ask and challenge with some really important questions like, how would this thing or how would this issue look on the front page? They challenge and guide organizations in times of issues and crisis, how to handle them transparently and honestly, so that can turn into a situation that builds trust rather than destroy it. And they're often the ones who are passionate believers and advocates for how an organization meaningfully engages with the community in which they serve. So of course, conflict does arise, particularly when the intent of the organization doesn't align with the ethics of the PR practitioner. And you can really see that manifest in ways right before us now. In many modern democracies around the world, we've seen a crisis in confidence with the political class who've put, in many cases, spin over substance. And it's destroyed the relationship and destroyed the trust between them and the journalists that write. And as a result, we're seeing very much that journalists are really chiding and admonishing the politicians because they don't have the substance, they don't have the transparency or honesty in how they're presenting themselves. And in turn, that's completely undermining the reputation of the PR practitioners and also the politicians themselves in the eyes of the community. So it's had the completely opposite effect. So, I think that a good PR practitioner really understands that you have to stand on ethics. You have to be the voice and the one who teaches the organizations in times of doubt. And through that, both their relationship with the journalist and their reputation stands intact and stands a test of time. It's critically important.
Going to develop in the future?
That's a very interesting question because, of course, change, as they say, is the only constant, and things are definitely going to change a lot. The advancement of technology, the advancement of journalism and PR practitioners themselves, and in fact the consumers, the readers, everything is going to change and continue to dramatically, and that's going to affect the relationship. So what's definitely true is that all of us have to be adaptable. PR practitioners and journalists themselves are going to have to work through all of these changes as they come and figure out how to adapt and how to move and how to do things differently. I'm sure that's only going to accelerate. And those tips that I've given, around how to establish trust, they're good now, and I do think that truth of having good content will always be there, but some of them will die off and new ones will develop as everything continues. But, I think some core things do remain. As much as this relationship can be tested at times, under the weight of change, agendas and expectations, I really do believe those core principles remain true. The need for trust, the need for great stories, the need for information and indeed entertainment. These things will continue to be there and they will continue to drive these professions closer together.